At the height of its power, Rome didn't just rule the world, it priced it. Inside the Colosseum, death wasn't punishment. It was lawful ritual, where prisoners were thrown to lions, women burned alive in pitch-soaked tunics, and a man playing Orpheus was ripped apart by a real bear mid-song. Over 9,000 animals were slaughtered during Trajan's victory games to prove that the empire's power reached beyond life itself. This wasn't entertainment. It was a political system written in blood, turning pain into loyalty and cruelty into order. So who truly paid for Rome's glory? The conquered, or the citizens cheering above the sand? The chronicles stay silent. Bones, ledgers, and blood-soaked dust will speak. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Dawn in Rome was unlike any other city in the world. Before the first sunlight hit the marble arches of the Colosseum, the lower chambers were already alive. The sound of chains scraping stone, the cries of handlers pushing half-starved lions into cages, and the metallic ring of swords being tested for the day's work. Above them, vendors arranged baskets of olives and watered wine. 5 hours before the first execution, the market of death was already open. The Colosseum was not a theatre. It was a factory, designed to process bodies into obedience. Every scream was a declaration of loyalty, every corpse a political receipt. The crowd was not there to watch combat. They were there to watch power perform itself. The emperor's command was clear. Rome did not just conquer nations, it conquered the very meaning of pain. What began as funeral games, blood spilled to honor the dead, had evolved into a civic obligation. By the 1st century, the spectacle had been absorbed into the law. Executions, reenactments, even mythological plays ended not with applause, but with real bodies on the ground. When a man was cast as Orpheus, he did not act. He became the myth, torn apart as the crowd laughed. When arsonists were punished, they were forced to wear the tunica molesta, their clothes soaked in pitch, their screams rising like torches. To Rome, cruelty was order, violence was ritual, death was law. And yet, this system worked brilliantly. The masses who once feared the empire now worshipped it. Each act of horror was advertised as justice. Each mutilation a reminder that to live peacefully under Rome was a privilege, not a right. The citizens roared, not in protest, but in unity. It was governance disguised as celebration. Underneath, the slaves who dragged corpses away knew the truth, that the games were not to entertain, but to erase. To erase the individual, to erase dissent, to erase compassion itself. By the end of each day, the sand would be raked clean, the blood washed away, and the ledger reset. Rome called that peace, but beneath the stone, the bones remained, whispering the same question we still ask today. When civilization begins to worship cruelty, how long before it destroys itself? The first Roman gladiator didn't fight for glory. He fought for someone else's funeral. In 264 BCE, the heirs of Decimus Junius Brutus Scaeva wanted to honor their father's death, but not with marble or poetry. They bought 6 slaves, armed them with dull swords, and ordered them to kill each other in the livestock market, a place that smelled of smoke, dung, and blood. It was meant to be an offering to the spirits of the dead. But what they created that day was far more powerful. The first prototype of state-controlled violence. The Romans called it munus, duty, obligation, gift, a word that hid cruelty behind the mask of reverence. The idea was simple. When someone dies, a life must be repaid. A balance must be restored. Each death in the arena became a transaction, a spiritual tax paid to keep the dead silent and the living obedient. And the people loved it. What began as a private ceremony of grief turned into a public addiction. The audience didn't mourn, they shouted. They didn't see two slaves killing each other. They saw Rome's power reenacted in miniature. When the first blood hit the ground, something shifted. The crowd didn't look away. They leaned closer. And that was the moment the Republic learned the most dangerous lesson in its history, that horror could be managed, even monetized. By the 3rd century BCE, the munera were no longer funeral offerings, but civic events. Senators competed to host grander, bloodier games. Every duel was an advertisement for power. To sponsor death was to buy loyalty. The crowd's roar became a political currency, the arena a polling station. The games grew organized. The state standardized them, drafting contracts for trainers, suppliers, and undertakers. Every corpse had paperwork. Every sword had regulation. The line between faith and bureaucracy dissolved. The Republic had turned murder into administration. Rome's historians often describe these contests as rites of remembrance, but beneath the language of duty lay cold efficiency. A man's life was no longer sacred. It was measurable, billable, and expendable. Each slain body was proof that the social order still worked. The noble commanded, the slave obeyed, and the crowd confirmed both with applause. The transformation spread quickly. Religious festivals like the Ludi Romani, once devoted to Jupiter, began featuring human combat. The priest's blessing introduced slaughter. Prayers mingled with the stench of iron. Killing became ritual. Watching became participation. The Romans told themselves it was piety. In truth, it was training, moral conditioning through repetition. Even the armor carried propaganda. The first gladiators were dressed as Rome's defeated enemies: Samnites, Thracians, Gauls. The very nations that once defied Rome were now forced to die again for her amusement. To watch them fall in the arena was to relive victory, to rehearse domination. Every duel was a lesson. This is what happens when you resist Rome. By the late Republic, politicians like Julius Caesar had mastered the art of using the games as public theatre. He sponsored massive spectacles, hundreds of fighters, entire herds of exotic animals, and called them munera, gifts to the people. But these gifts were poisoned. They dulled the citizens' anger, bought their silence, and bound them with spectacle. Bread and blood replaced law and debate. The mob, once dangerous, became docile. Cicero saw the danger. He warned that those who take pleasure in blood will never govern with mercy. But Rome had already chosen its morality. Violence worked. It unified, distracted, and entertained. The arena became a mirror, reflecting everything the Republic believed about power, that obedience must be visible, and domination must be shared. Soon, whole industries grew around the games. Blacksmiths forged weapons designed not for efficiency, but for effect. Armor was polished to blind the eye, helmets shaped to mock the vanquished. Even death was staged. Some men were given wooden swords to make their defeat amusing. Others were crippled before the fight to ensure the right outcome. The Senate pretended these duels honored the ancestors. In truth, they honored control itself. And yet, behind the chants and cheers, the logic was flawless. The state had found a way to make the people complicit. Every Roman who applauded a kill became part of the mechanism. The arena transformed the citizen into a witness, and the witness into a participant. The spectacle wasn't just meant to terrify slaves, it was meant to educate free men, to remind them that the law was not built to protect life, but to administer it. This was the birth of what scholars later called the politics of cruelty. A Rome had discovered that to rule minds, it must first rule bodies, publicly, repeatedly, without remorse. The gladiator's death was the empire's most efficient form of propaganda. It said nothing, but it convinced everyone. And when the crowd rose to cheer, they believed they were celebrating courage. But they were worshipping something else entirely, a system that taught them to love their own obedience. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome had achieved what no other civilization had dared. It legalized horror. The munus, once a debt to the dead, had evolved into a civic contract. No longer a family duty, no longer an act of faith, it became an obligation of the state. The arena was no longer a place of grief, it was an institution, where obedience was rehearsed and violence was regulated like commerce. When the Senate began funding the games, something irreversible happened. Cruelty became public policy. The same government that wrote tax laws now wrote death laws. Lex Julia Theatralis dictated who could sit where, senators closest to the blood, slaves farthest from sight, a visual map of hierarchy carved into stone. Even death had seating arrangements. The message was unmistakable. Power was proximity. The closer you sat to the killing, the more Rome trusted you. Soon, no public festival was complete without its sanctioned killings. The Ludi Romani once honored Jupiter with plays and sacrifices. Now it included executions. Priests blessed the sand before blood was spilled. Myth and murder blended into one ritual. The gods were entertained, and so were the citizens. The Republic had found a new kind of religion, order through cruelty. And cruelty was efficient. Executions filled the calendar. Some were public justice. Thieves burned, deserters crucified, traitors thrown to beasts. Others were theatrical, reenactments of myths where convicts played doomed heroes. A prisoner dressed as Hercules would be burned alive to mimic his fiery death. Another, playing Orpheus, would sing to wild animals before being ripped apart mid-song. The line between art and atrocity vanished. Rome didn't just rewrite its myths, it weaponized them. Even nature was absorbed into this system. Exotic animals were captured across 3 continents: lions from Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile. They weren't shown as wonders of creation, but as proof of Rome's dominion. Each beast killed on the sand declared, "Even nature kneels before us." The empire's zoos became its supply chains of terror. Cages dragged across deserts, ships filled with starving predators. Archaeologists later found bones scarred by whips, filed teeth, deliberate starvation marks. The cruelty wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Every execution, every hunt, Every scream served a purpose. The crowd was not passive. It was complicit. Applause became participation. Silence became defiance. When the emperor raised his hand, thousands of voices obeyed. He did not simply rule, he conducted. The arena was a symphony of death, orchestrated to teach a lesson, that Rome could command even the timing of agony. Behind the sand, logistics kept the machine running. Workshops repaired weapons dulled by slaughter. Accountants logged expenses, nails for crucifixions, oil for torches, chains for captives. The ledgers of death were as detailed as any trade record. Rome's cruelty was not madness, it was management. The empire's greatest innovation wasn't the aqueduct or the road. It was the administration of fear. The audience believed they were watching justice, but in truth, they were watching themselves. Each spectacle was a mirror, reflecting Rome's hierarchy, economy, and ideology. The emperor ruled, the senators sponsored, the crowd obeyed. The arena united them in complicity. It was democracy inverted, participation through silence. Seneca, one of the few who dared to criticize, described his horror. "I came expecting punishment, but found amusement. Men kill, and it's called law. They burn, and it's called ceremony." He understood what the games truly meant, the normalization of cruelty. To be Roman was no longer to be virtuous, it was to be entertained. Compassion became treason, disgust became weakness. And soon, even philosophers stopped writing. What was left to say when the people called murder sacred? Beneath the arena floor, reality was worse. Thousands of enslaved workers, mostly foreigners and prisoners, handled the bodies. They scrubbed blood from the sand, reset the stage, and prepared the next round. No applause greeted them. No name was recorded. They were Rome's invisible engineers of obedience, keeping the illusion of perfection alive. Overhead, senators toasted to victory, poets immortalized the spectacle, and emperors smiled for statues. The Colosseum became the empire's beating heart, a monument not to beauty, but to control. Every drop of blood spilled there reminded the people that Rome ruled not just the living world, but the moral one. Death itself had become a form of governance. The genius of the system lay in its simplicity. People believed they were watching punishment. In reality, they were witnessing their own submission. The games blurred the line between loyalty and complicity until the two became indistinguishable. Rome had found the perfect tool of control, a spectacle that made the crowd thank their rulers for their own desensitization. By the 1st century BCE, the transformation was complete. The Republic's rituals of remembrance had become the empire's machinery of fear. Law was no longer about justice. It was about theater. Order was no longer about peace. It was about performance. And at the center of it all stood the emperor, a god among corpses, ruling a people who mistook blood for glory. If blood was the language of power, then Rome spoke it fluently. But there came a time when even human deaths were not enough. The empire needed something grander, something that proved its dominion reached beyond men, beyond nations, even beyond nature itself. And so began one of the most monstrous chapters in human history, the Venationes, the great animal hunts. They called them games, but the logistics resembled military campaigns. Lions from Numidia, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from Egypt, elephants from India, all chained, starved, and shipped across deserts and seas to die on Roman sand. Caravans dragged cages through blistering heat. Slave crews hauled beasts up riverbeds. By the time they reached the Colosseum, most were half dead, trembling shadows of the wild creatures they once were. The crowd didn't care. To see an elephant fall, a bear shriek, or a panther leap before being impaled, that was not just amusement, it was reassurance. Every dying creature reminded the citizens that their empire was absolute, that even the wilderness obeyed Roman command. The games turned nature itself into propaganda. When the Colosseum was inaugurated in 80 CE, Emperor Titus staged the largest slaughter in recorded history. Over 9,000 animals killed in a single festival lasting 100 days. Poets like Martial described it as a celebration of majesty. But beneath the rhetoric lay a grotesque truth. It was ecological genocide. Entire species vanished from their homelands to fuel Rome's addiction to spectacle. African lions disappeared from the Maghreb for centuries. Elephants were hunted to near extinction. The empire's appetite for blood stripped continents bare. The animals weren't killed for food, nor for defense. They were killed for symbolism. The lion stood for Africa conquered, the tiger for Asia subdued, the elephant for strength domesticated. Each death was a visual conquest, a living map of imperial reach drawn in fur and blood. The more exotic the beast, the greater the emperor's glory. Power was no longer measured in territory, but in trophies. Behind the spectacle lay an enormous economy of suffering. The capture, transport, and maintenance of animals employed thousands. Hunters, wranglers, trainers, sailors, merchants, and slaves. Each link in the chain was soaked in misery. Animals were caged in cramped ships, beaten to keep them quiet, starved to make them violent. Trainers deliberately weakened lions before the fight so they would die faster, ensuring a cleaner show. Records unearthed in austere detail orders for panther shipments, with instructions to feed them little before the event to make them desperate. Rome had turned starvation into stagecraft, and yet the cruelty wasn't mindless. It was method. Every detail, from the color of the sand to the hour of the hunt, was chosen to manipulate emotion. Morning fights featured weaker beasts to warm up the crowd. Midday executions fed their appetite for human blood. Afternoon hunts brought the crescendo. Exotic predators, trained killers, and condemned men cast as prey. By sunset, the audience's thirst was satisfied, their loyalty renewed. Rome had mastered a psychological formula that dictators would replicate for millennia. Fear packaged as entertainment. The emperors knew exactly what they were doing. When Julius Caesar displayed the first giraffe ever seen in Europe, he wasn't introducing a marvel of nature. He was announcing that there was nothing left beyond Rome's reach. Commodus, centuries later, took it further. Dressed as Hercules, he entered the arena to personally kill hundreds of animals, many of them tied or crippled beforehand. The crowd screamed his name, terrified to stay silent. Even the beasts had become props in the emperor's ego, but the cruelty carried a hidden cost. The empire was eating itself. The importation of animals drained resources. Ships that could have carried grain were filled with cages. Traders risked their lives for trophies instead of trade. And yet, the Senate never questioned it, because as long as the people cheered, the illusion of order held. blood was cheaper than bread and far more effective. Seneca once wrote, "We have enslaved nature, and in doing so, unlearned what it means to be human." He was right. Rome's relationship with nature mirrored its relationship with people. Both existed only to serve power. When the crowd applauded a lion's death, they were also applauding their own captivity, because every spectacle of domination reinforced their role in it. And yet, beneath the grandeur, there were moments of rebellion, not from men, but from the animals themselves. There are accounts of elephants breaking through barriers, of lions turning on their handlers, of leopards mauling senators who sat too close. In those brief moments, the illusion cracked. The Colosseum was reminded that nature, though chained, was not conquered. The empire's gods of order bled like any mortal when the wild struck back. But the lesson was quickly buried. The next day, new animals arrived. More cages, more blood. Rome could not stop, because the spectacle wasn't about victory anymore. It was about continuity. As long as something died in the arena, Rome felt alive. When modern archaeologists excavated the Colosseum's hypogeum, they found grooves in the stone floors, carved by centuries of dragging cages, marks of captivity that outlasted the empire itself. Those scratches tell the real story, not of glory, but of dependence. Rome had chained the world, and in doing so, chained itself to its own cruelty. By the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire had become the most efficient killing machine in history, and not just of men. Its appetite for spectacle had devoured the living world. Forests were emptied, seas drained of creatures, deserts scarred with the tracks of caravans carrying cages. Nature itself was now part of the empire's tribute system. Each region sent its beasts as offerings to Rome, not as symbols of respect, but as victims. Inscriptions recovered from port cities like Ostia and Puteoli record endless shipments. 20 panthers from Numidia, 6 elephants from India, 40 crocodiles from the Nile. The supply chains stretched farther than any army, proof that Rome could not only conquer nations, but ecosystems. Every exotic species captured was a statement of ownership. Every dead animal on the sand was a document of power. The hunts, or venaciones, were scheduled like festivals. Morning announcements listed the beasts to be slain, the name of the sponsor, and the number of executions planned. Each show was meticulously designed for psychological impact, variety, escalation, climax. A day at the games might begin with small carnivores, followed by wolves or bears, and end with elephants or bulls, their deaths orchestrated for rhythm and spectacle. To Rome, even extinction had choreography. The Colosseum itself was built to enable this new scale of slaughter. Beneath its floor lay an elaborate network of lifts, pulleys, and tunnels, the hypogeum, capable of releasing dozens of animals simultaneously. One lever could send a pack of leopards leaping into sunlight. Another could raise a stage soaked in blood for the next act. The system was revolutionary, an industrialized altar of sacrifice. This mechanical perfection masked ecological ruin. The North African savannas that once echoed with lion calls fell silent within a century. Regions in Syria and Anatolia lost their native leopards and bears. Romans described this silence as the triumph of order. But in truth, it was a wasteland, the sound of nature replaced by applause. Philosophers and naturalists began to notice the disappearance. Pliny the Elder wrote bitterly that the beasts of Africa die not in their lands, but in ours. His words were less lament than prophecy. By the 2nd century, entire species had vanished simply because the empire demanded entertainment. No battlefield, no army had destroyed life as efficiently as peace had. What made this cruelty so insidious was its moral disguise. The Romans called the hunts proof of virtue. They said taming the wild showed courage and dominion. But taming became killing, and killing became performance. In killing lions, Rome convinced itself it was civilizing the world. The greater the death toll, the deeper the faith in imperial order. The arena had turned extinction into theology. This ideology extended even to children. Roman mosaics depicted small boys training animals with whips, mimicking the games. Murals in villas showed exotic beasts dying beautifully, stylized, aesthetic, harmless. In this art, the animal was not a creature, but an emblem, a visual shorthand for submission. Generations grew up seeing the world not as shared, but as possessed. The economy reinforced the illusion. Traders who once moved olive oil or grain now specialized in beast cargo. They built entire markets for captured animals, each sale recorded, taxed, and blessed by the state. The empire had turned the natural world into inventory. In one surviving ledger, the death of a rhinoceros is listed next to amphorae of wine, priced, weighed, transported. It was not murder, it was merchandise. Emperors gloried in this commerce of death. Augustus filled artificial lakes for naval battles, while Nero ordered forests cut down to build cages. Domitian personally supervised hunts, shouting commands like a general. Commodus took the final step, blurring godhood and cruelty. He dressed as Hercules and hunted from a gilded platform, firing arrows at tethered beasts that couldn't move. The crowd roared, not from admiration, but fear. Even the animals had been stripped of dignity, even the emperor of sanity. Yet the symbolism was precise. Every spectacle declared nature itself had been conquered. The empire stood not only above men, but above creation. No river, no mountain, no living thing existed outside its reach. And the people believed it. As long as the sand stayed red, Rome felt eternal. But eternity demands a cost. The vast animal trade hollowed Rome's provinces. Hunters emptied jungles. Farmers lost oxen needed for ploughing. Ports decayed under the weight of endless shipments. An empire that fed on blood began starving itself. By the time the crowds noticed the silence, fewer beasts, smaller spectacles, the damage was irreversible. The very world that sustained Rome's illusion of power had been consumed by it. When the last lions vanished from North Africa, no one mourned. The poets wrote of glory, not loss. The crowds demanded new horrors, fire, crucifixion, naval battles in flooded arenas. Rome could no longer stop. Its identity had fused with the ritual of killing. Centuries later, when the Colosseum's sands turned to dust, its legacy endured. Not in law or philosophy, but in memory. In the human belief that to control is to destroy, and to destroy is to rule. The ruins still stand, silent but accusing. Each broken arch whispers the same warning. A civilization that conquers the natural world will not survive it. Continue. By the 1st century CE, Rome had perfected a terrifying formula: pain as order, death as governance. Every part of the empire's judicial and political system was now woven into spectacle. Executions, once solemn and private, became public theatre. Justice was no longer blind. It sold tickets. At midday, when the morning's animal hunts had exhausted the crowd's curiosity, but not their appetite, the second act began. The damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. It was not a punishment, it was choreography. Men and women, prisoners of war, slaves, deserters, rebels, thieves, were marched into the sand, unarmed, in costume. Some were dressed as mythic heroes: Prometheus, bound and pecked by birds; Orpheus, singing before lions; Hercules, engulfed in fire. Their deaths were scripted to imitate legend, so that execution looked like destiny. It was, in every sense, state theatre. The crowd adored it. When the lions lunged or the fire caught, 50,000 voices erupted. Children threw flowers, vendors sold olives, senators took notes for their speeches. It wasn't horror, it was routine. To be Roman meant to watch death beautifully staged. The spectacle reminded everyone that Rome didn't just own land or bodies, it owned meaning. In the most infamous shows, prisoners were forced to reenact the myths of punishment. One condemned man, playing Orpheus, played his lyre as trained animals circled him, until a real bear tore him apart mid-song. Another, dressed as Icarus, was hoisted by a crude mechanism meant to mimic flight, then dropped into the beasts below. A woman portraying Dirce was tied to a bull and dragged until she ceased to move. Each act was a parody of culture, civilization eating its own art. The cruelty was more than sadism. It was pedagogy. It taught the citizens that rebellion had no poetry, that disobedience would not only be crushed, but humiliated. To die was one thing. To die as entertainment. That was Rome's final domination. The organization behind these shows was immense. The state hired engineers to build stage devices that could simulate volcanoes, rainstorms, and floods. The arena could be flooded and drained within hours, transforming from desert to sea. The logistics rivaled any modern production. Only the actors didn't survive. Each new emperor tried to outdo his predecessor in scale and spectacle. Trajan's 103-day games slaughtered thousands of prisoners to celebrate victory in Dacia. It wasn't just revenge, it was demonstration. Rome's mercy was optional, its cruelty infinite. The actors, the condemned, came from everywhere: Gauls, Jews, Africans, Greeks. For the audience, this was symbolic. Watching them die wasn't personal vengeance, it was imperial confirmation. Every execution replayed conquest, turning war into ritual and ritual into loyalty. The arena became an ongoing reenactment of empire, its power written in screams. But as the cruelty grew, the boundary between justice and entertainment dissolved completely. The same word, munus, described both funerals and games, both duty and pleasure. To watch a man die became a civic act, even a moral one. The people believed the spectacles purified Rome. Seneca disagreed. They do not cleanse the soul, they soil it. But Seneca's voice was a whisper against the roar. Not everyone in the arena was a criminal. Some were ordinary citizens, condemned for debts, blasphemy, or merely offending an official. The empire's bureaucracy found in the games a perfect instrument of discipline. To die in public was cheaper than to imprison. To kill publicly was more effective than to persuade. Fear was policy, and policy was entertainment. The political messaging was explicit. When rebels were executed, the herald announced their crimes before the crowd. Their bodies became warnings, their suffering a sermon. Rome didn't just punish treason, it performed it. The audience didn't merely watch, they were enlisted into the machinery of control, learning that to survive meant to cheer. For women and enslaved people, the cruelty was doubled. Female prisoners were forced to play mythic sinners. Pasiphae with her bull, Medea killing her children, or Semiramis consumed by snakes. Their deaths titillated and moralized at once, a lesson wrapped in spectacle. Even virtue was weaponized. Chastity, rebellion, and love. All punished, all sold as art. The irony was complete. The culture that built aqueducts, codified law, and wrote philosophy also turned human agony into performance art. The same empire that prided itself on civitas, civilization, had made barbarity its liturgy. And yet, perhaps the most disturbing detail is not what happened in the sand, but what happened above it. Thousands of Roman citizens, ordinary men and women, watched and clapped and went home in peace. They told themselves it was justice, not cruelty. Ritual, not sin. That illusion was Rome's true masterpiece, teaching a people to mistake atrocity for order. By the end of the 1st century, this system had no brakes. The spectacles had outgrown their purpose. Executions no longer symbolized law, they were the law. The emperor decided who lived, who died, and how painfully. The games became a mirror of governance itself, arbitrary, ritualized, and absolute. Rome had transformed the idea of punishment into an art form, and in doing so, it erased the line between civilization and insanity. If the midday executions were Rome's theatre, then the evening belonged to its rituals of fire. When the beasts had been killed, when the crowds had eaten, when the air was heavy with iron and smoke, the torches were brought out. But these were not torches of wood or wax. They were people. Condemned prisoners were dressed in the tunica molesta, a garment soaked in pitch and oil. Once lit, they became living flames, writhing in agony as the crowd applauded the purification of the city. Vendors sold wine while the condemned screamed. Children pointed, fascinated. And when the flames died, the ashes were swept away as if nothing had happened. The Romans called it justice, but in truth, it was theatre disguised as morality. The empire claimed these executions, honored the gods, and cleansed corruption. But every burning body was a message. To challenge Rome was to be erased, not just killed, but made useful in dying. The use of fire in punishment wasn't new. It came from the East, from Carthage, from Persia. But Rome perfected it, institutionalized it, celebrated it. The condemned were paraded before the crowd, their crimes announced by a herald, their faces smeared with ash. When the oil-soaked tunic caught flame, the spectators cheered the same way they did for a gladiator's kill. To the Romans, the fire symbolized order triumphing over chaos. To the victims, it was hell on earth, with applause. One historian, Tertullian, later wrote bitterly, "They call it punishment. we call it sacrifice. And he was right. Fire had become sacred, a tool not of destruction, but of ideology. Rome burned its enemies not to destroy them, but to convert their suffering into unity. This logic reached its apex under Emperor Nero. In 64 CE, after a fire consumed much of the city, Nero needed scapegoats. He found them among the Christians, a small, despised sect blamed for defying imperial cult worship. They were rounded up, imprisoned, and condemned for the greater peace. But Nero didn't just execute them, he made them art. By night, the emperor opened his gardens to guests. The trees were decorated, music played, wine poured, and Christians were burned alive as lamps to light the festivities. Eyewitnesses described figures glowing in the dark, silent, motionless, twisted like wax. The crowd feasted by the light of human bodies. The empire had found its purest spectacle. Faith turned into illumination. Even Roman senators found it obscene. Tacitus, though no Christian sympathizer, wrote that the executions awakened pity, for it seemed not to the public good, but to the cruelty of one man. But pity was not policy. Nero's message was clear. Rome's mercy ended where loyalty began. To worship any god above the emperor was to forfeit the right to humanity. The Christians' deaths, however, had unintended consequences. What was meant to be deterrence became witness. As they burned, they prayed, sang hymns, forgave their executioners. The crowd, for the first time, fell silent. Rome's ritual of dominance had accidentally birthed a new symbol, one that outlasted the empire itself. Philosophically, the spectacle revealed the deepest contradiction of Roman power. The state claimed to embody pietas, duty to gods, family, and law. Yet, in practice, it destroyed all three. The fires that lit Nero's gardens did not purify the city. They scorched its conscience. By turning human beings into torches, Rome proved it had lost its light. Economically, these executions were efficient. A slave condemned to death cost nothing to feed, nothing to bury. His body provided heat, spectacle, and warning, the three currencies of control. The emperor didn't just burn people, he budgeted them. Archaeologists have even found lists of condemned prisoners paired with the quantities of oil required for their illumination. The bureaucracy of cruelty was precise. Fire symbolized both power and cleansing. But as Rome's dependence on spectacle deepened, the line between purification and perversion vanished. Burning became a ritual of reassurance, a way for citizens to feel morally cleansed while remaining complicit. They could watch death, call it justice, and leave the arena convinced they were good. Yet, beneath that illusion was a quiet horror. The more Rome burned, the darker it became. The flames that illuminated its nights were feeding on the very idea of civilization. And when those fires died, only smoke remained, carrying the stench of a society that had learned to destroy itself beautifully. Because in the end, Rome didn't fall to barbarians. It fell to its own theatre, a stage so bright with burning bodies that it blinded the empire to its decay. Rome had long mastered the art of killing others, but eventually it turned inward, when emperors began to kill for themselves. The Colosseum, once a temple to the state, became a mirror for imperial madness. And in that reflection, the difference between ruler and god dissolved into blood. It began as competition, each emperor striving to outshine his predecessors in cruelty and scale. Julius Caesar flooded arenas to stage mock naval battles, where hundreds of captives drowned as ships clashed for the crowd's delight. Augustus expanded the spectacles, declaring them proof of divine favor. Under Domitian, the games became state propaganda, reinforcing hierarchy, law, and myth. But then came the ones who confused performance with divinity: Nero, Caligula, Commodus. Each believed the stage could make them immortal, if only they killed enough to deserve it. Caligula, for instance, loved spontaneity. When the supply of criminals ran low, he ordered random citizens from the audience to be thrown into the arena. One contemporary wrote, "He believed the gods too merciful and sought to correct them." His cruelty wasn't about justice, it was about creation. He saw blood as canvas. The arena wasn't a courtroom anymore, it was a palette. And every death was a brushstroke on Rome's collective conscience. Then came Nero, artist, actor, musician, executioner. He performed songs while men died, reciting verses as flames rose from condemned bodies. He considered the screams background music. The citizens of Rome called him insane, but they still watched. Because in Nero's Rome, the line between entertainment and governance had vanished completely. When the emperor sang, they listened, because silence meant suspicion, and suspicion, in Rome, meant death. But the empire's true grotesque masterpiece was Commodus, the emperor who turned the arena into his private stage. He dressed as Hercules, the demigod of conquest, wielding a golden club. He killed bears, lions, even ostriches, all tethered, crippled, or declawed beforehand. He charged the state treasury a fortune for his performances, claiming payment as if he were a professional gladiator. He even gave himself a new name, Romanus Hercules Victoriosus, the victorious Hercules of Rome. To the Senate, he was a monster. To the terrified crowds, a god in flesh. Commodus didn't just play the hero, he played every role. He fought as a gladiator against men ordered not to resist, then boasted of hundreds of victories. He decapitated ostriches and waved their heads before senators, a silent warning of what awaited descent. Sometimes he hunted at midnight, by torchlight, forcing noblemen to attend. These weren't games anymore, they were sermons of terror. The message was unmistakable. I am the only god you can see bleed. The Senate despised him, but couldn't oppose him. Applause became law, obedience, worship. And in that silence, the empire revealed its sickness. When power loses restraint, it becomes theatre. And when theatre becomes government, truth itself burns away. The philosopher Cassius Dio, who witnessed these events, wrote that the people feared his performances more than his decrees. It was no longer possible to tell whether Commodus ruled Rome or merely performed it. He had turned governance into performance art, and Rome's citizens into unpaid extras. Eventually, paranoia devoured him. He demanded the months of the year be renamed after himself. He erected statues portraying his face on Hercules' body. He planned to open the year 193 CE with a divine rebirth ceremony, killing hundreds of men in a single festival. But the night before, he was strangled in his bath by a wrestler. One final gladiatorial irony. The man who wanted to be a god died like a prop. After his death, the Senate declared damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of his memory. Every inscription, every statue, every painting of him was destroyed. But the damage was irreversible. Commodus had proven that Rome no longer needed an emperor to lead, only to perform. The empire itself had become addicted to the spectacle of its own power, and that addiction outlived every tyrant. Each new emperor, no matter how rational, had to feed it, with games, with blood, with spectacle, because the Roman people, once desensitized, demanded it. They had learned to measure authority not by justice, but by entertainment value. The Colosseum, once built to immortalize Rome's might, had become a theater of decay, where gods were fake, deaths were real, and truth was the first casualty. From Caligula's spontaneous executions to Commodus's divine cosplay, Rome's emperors wrote their legacy in the same language, the grammar of spectacle, the syntax of terror. And behind the applause, an empire slowly crumbled, not from invasion, but from performance exhaustion. Because even tyranny, when staged too often, begins to lose its audience. By the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire was bleeding, not just in the sand, but in its coffers. Every drop of blood spilled in the arena came with a price tag. Behind the spectacle, an invisible economy thrived, one built on corpses, logistics, and applause. Rome's games were not only moral decay, they were financial suicide disguised as grandeur. The emperors competed not in wisdom, but in excess. Each ruler had to outdo the last, not with conquests, but with cruelty. And cruelty was expensive. Thousands of animals imported, hundreds of slaves bought, ships hired, cages built, sand replaced. A single festival under Emperor Trajan, 103 days long, cost more than many provincial wars. Historians estimate it drained a fifth of Rome's treasury. And yet, it was considered necessary. Because to rule Rome, one had to feed its addiction to spectacle. The empire's budget became a reflection of its psychology. Bread and circuses, panem et circenses, became the new contract between ruler and ruled. As long as the people were entertained, they would not revolt. And so, emperors became producers. The arena was their propaganda, the crowd their audience, the blood their currency. Governance was now performance management. The logistics were staggering. Exotic animals came from all corners of the empire, elephants from Carthage, tigers from Parthia, leopards from Numidia. They were captured, caged, starved, and shipped across deserts and seas. Each shipment recorded in the state's ledgers. 40 leopards, 6 dead in transport, tax paid. Each life calculated, costed, written off. Even the sand had an account line. Arena sand, stained with blood, was replaced daily. 200 tons at a time, imported from Egypt for its golden color, because Rome wanted its death to look beautiful. This wasn't chaos, it was administration. The same empire that built aqueducts and roads applied the same precision to cruelty. Every execution, every beast, every prop had a receipt. Even the deaths were rehearsed to ensure the timing of screams matched the audience's appetite. This was not madness, it was management. But the true cost was moral and structural. As the treasury emptied, Rome's discipline eroded. Generals stopped campaigning. Senators stopped legislating. Everyone, from aristocrats to beggars, lived for the next festival. Juvenal called them children of the circus, citizens raised on distraction. They no longer cared who ruled, as long as someone kept the games coming. Bread for the stomach, blood for the eyes. That was the social contract of empire. Even emperors who despised the games couldn't stop them. To deny spectacle was to invite rebellion. In 240 CE, Emperor Gordian VI reduced the number of games to save money. Within weeks, riots broke out in the Forum. Crowds stormed the palace, shouting, "We want the beasts!" Order was restored by promising more blood. It was the perfect paradox. Rome ruled the world, but was ruled by its audience. Economically, the spectacles hollowed the state from within. By the time of the later emperors, the cost of maintaining the arenas rivaled the cost of defending the borders. Granaries emptied to feed the crowds. Soldiers went unpaid so the lions could be fed. Rome's power, once built on discipline, now depended on distraction. The empire had traded its armies for applause. Philosophers saw the decay clearly. Seneca lamented, "The games teach the soul to enjoy cruelty." Cicero warned that indulgence destroys republics faster than invasion. But no one listened. Their words were drowned by the roar of 50,000 voices demanding more. The games had become a moral algorithm, feeding on its own logic. To stop was weakness. To continue was ruin. The emperors knew this and chose ruin, because stopping the spectacle would mean facing the truth, that Rome's unity no longer came from law or virtue, but from shared violence. Even religion was absorbed into the economics of death. When Christianity began spreading through the empire, its followers refused to attend the games. To the Romans, this was treason, not of law, but of spirit. The refusal to participate broke the unspoken pact. That citizenship required complicity. In that sense, the early Christians weren't just rebels of faith. They were rebels of economy. They refused to fund the system with their eyes, and that made them dangerous. The irony was that the empire that conquered nations through discipline was now enslaved by entertainment. The arenas had become its lungs, breathing in screams, breathing out loyalty. But each breath cost gold, and soon there was none left to spend. By the 3rd century, Rome's debts mounted. Senators mortgaged estates, provinces delayed tax shipments, soldiers went unpaid. And yet, the games continued. Because silence in the Colosseum was unthinkable. So the state borrowed, stole, and devalued its currency to keep the crowds roaring. In a tragic inversion of justice, the empire that once taxed the world now taxed itself to death. The applause still thundered, but it was hollow, echoing off stone. And beneath that sound, an empire was quietly bankrupting not just its treasury, but its soul. Because when blood becomes currency and applause becomes law, even victory becomes an illusion. By the 4th century, the applause began to fade. The crowd still gathered, but their roars felt thinner, routine, exhausted. The Colosseum's stones still gleamed in the sun, but beneath them, the empire had hollowed out. The games had devoured not only Rome's enemies, but Rome itself. The empire that once ruled by fear now ruled by habit, and habit is the slowest form of decay. The signs of collapse were everywhere. The supply chains of death faltered. Caravans lost in deserts, ships capsized in storms, cages arrived empty. Africa's lions had been hunted nearly extinct, Asia's elephants too costly to ship. Nature itself seemed to rebel. The empire's best victims were gone. And with them, Rome's illusion of control began to crumble. The finances were worse. Inflation soared. Silver coins turned to bronze, and the treasury's ledgers filled with debt. But the crowds still demanded spectacle. The emperors, desperate to buy loyalty, bankrupted themselves in the process. They fed the masses what they craved, not justice, not truth, but distraction. It was the perfect tragedy. A civilization that could no longer tell the difference between entertainment and survival. By this time, Christianity was spreading across the empire, slowly, quietly, like water through cracks in marble. Its followers refused to attend the games. They called the Colosseum a house of demons. To them, watching was participation, and participation was sin. Their refusal was revolutionary, because it withdrew the one thing Rome could not function without: the gaze. The Colosseum needed eyes. Without eyes, the blood meant nothing. Emperors tried to restore the old fervor. Diocletian, for example, doubled the game's scale to celebrate his divine rule, but his empire was already splitting. East and west, faith and fear. He could flood the arena, but not the emptiness of the people's hearts. Rome's grandeur had become a parody of itself, a ritual that no longer worked. The gods were gone, the audience was bored, and the empire was performing to no one. Even the architecture began to reflect the fatigue. Beneath the arena, the hypogeum, once a labyrinth of pulleys and cages, fell silent. The mechanisms rusted, the trapdoors jammed. No more beasts roared from the shadows. The sand hardened into dust, and the blood dried black. Rome's theatre of terror was quietly turning into a tomb. The final phase of decline came not from conquest, but from conscience. In 404 CE, after centuries of slaughter, something unprecedented happened. A single man interrupted the games. His name was Telemachus, a Christian monk from the east. He leapt into the arena to stop two gladiators from fighting. The crowd jeered. Then someone threw a stone. Others followed. Moments later, Telemachus lay dead on the sand he had tried to sanctify. But the world changed that day. The Emperor Honorius, horrified by the incident, issued an edict banning gladiatorial combat. The Colosseum fell silent. After nearly 700 years, Rome's bloodlust was declared illegal. And yet, it wasn't morality that ended the games. It was exhaustion. The system had consumed everything it could: gold, animals, souls, until there was nothing left to burn. The silence that followed was haunting. For the first time, the citizens of Rome could hear the echo of what they had applauded for centuries. What had once been worship now sounded like mourning. The empire's greatest monument had become its own confession. Philosophically, the end of the games marked the beginning of something Rome had long forgotten: introspection. The same society that once treated cruelty as ritual began to see it as madness. Christianity didn't invent mercy. Rome's collapse did. When the empire lost its power to terrify, it rediscovered the value of restraint. But it was too late. The moral rehabilitation came centuries after the soul had died. The Colosseum, once the heart of empire, became a ruin, scavenged for stone, haunted by memory. Wealthy Romans built palaces from its marble, unaware that they were building atop the graves of the enslaved. Nature reclaimed what civilization had desecrated. Grass grew through cracks. Rain washed the blood from the sand. The arena that once echoed with screams now whispered with wind. Yet, the ghost of the spectacle remained. Every empire that came after would remember Rome's formula: control through distraction, obedience through awe. From medieval executions to modern propaganda, the lesson endured. That power, once addicted to performance, never truly learns silence. The Colosseum stands today as both marvel and warning. Tourists walk its arches, take pictures, speak in hushed awe, unaware that beneath their feet lies the economic, moral, and psychological blueprint of every tyranny since. A civilization that made cruelty efficient, loyalty entertaining, and silence acceptable. Because Rome didn't die when its walls fell. It died the moment its people stopped feeling. And in that silence, that perfect, polished quiet, the empire finally heard the truth it had buried for centuries. That glory had always been a mask, and underneath it, there was only the sound of bones speaking. Rome's arenas fell silent, but their logic never died. The empire may have collapsed in 476 CE, but the idea it perfected, control through spectacle, outlived its ruins. Because what Rome invented was not just entertainment, it was a system, a philosophy of obedience disguised as joy. For centuries after, its shadow reappeared wherever power needed loyalty. In medieval Europe, kings held public executions for order. Heads rolled in marketplaces to remind peasants of their place, a smaller Colosseum in every city. The guillotine, centuries later, would slice through the same illusion that violence, when ritualized, could purify society. The Romans would have nodded in approval. The church that once condemned the games eventually inherited their structure. The cathedral replaced the arena. The sermon replaced the spectacle. But the crowd still gathered to watch salvation enacted before their eyes. The architecture even mimicked the Colosseum, circular, tiered, centralized, around a stage. Rome's genius had always been its ability to make obedience feel sacred. Now, that genius lived on in the rituals of faith and law. But the psychological inheritance was far more enduring. Rome taught the West how to feel powerful through witnessing pain. Empires that came after, Spanish, Ottoman, British, even modern states, all repeated the same formula: public punishment, glorious narrative, emotional participation. From burning heretics to televised wars, the grammar of spectacle remained unchanged. Consider the medieval execution square. Crowds gathered to see a thief hanged or a traitor drawn and quartered. Vendors sold bread and wine. Children sat on shoulders. It was the same choreography, centuries later, the same mingling of morality and curiosity. Pain was still pedagogy, and obedience was still a public performance. By the Enlightenment, the tools had evolved, but the principle had not. Public hangings became moral theatre. Revolutions promised freedom, yet they too built their own stages of execution. Paris in 1793 was a mirror of Rome in 80 CE. The guillotine had replaced the lion, but the applause was the same. Citizens gathered not to watch justice, but to feel righteous. Blood still meant belonging. Even modernity never escaped the Roman pattern. When gladiators vanished, soldiers took their place. War became the new spectacle, a theatre broadcast across borders, complete with heroes, villains, and cheering crowds. Propaganda films, victory parades, even televised bombings, all carry the DNA of the arena. Rome taught the world that power must be seen to be believed, and that nothing unites a people like the sight of an enemy's death. In politics too, the legacy lingers. From dictators' rallies to modern populism, the principle endures: turn governance into performance. Replace policy with pageantry. Transform obedience into emotion. Every flag waved, every chant shouted, every stage-lit speech echoes the Colosseum's roar. The emperor no longer wields a sword, he wields a microphone. But the audience is the same, waiting to be thrilled, not enlightened. The economic logic persists as well. Just as Rome taxed its citizens to fund their own sedation, modern states pour billions into spectacles, sports, propaganda, mass media, to maintain the illusion of unity. The bread is cheaper, the circuses are digital, but the principle is eternal: distraction as control. The blood may be pixelated now, but it still sells. What Rome left behind was not marble, but a mindset. It normalized complicity. It taught us that cruelty, when collective, feels righteous, that watching is harmless, that silence is wisdom, that applause is loyalty. It replaced morality with participation. And that substitution remains the most dangerous inheritance of all. Even our language betrays the lineage. Spectator, audience, arena, all Roman words, all reminders that citizenship was redefined long ago, from one who acts to one who watches. When we scroll through violence, when we watch suffering as content, we are not far from the amphitheater. We are sitting in the marble seats again, cheering, reacting, commenting. The only difference is that now, the sand fits in our hands. The bones of Rome speak still, through every repetition of its design. Its ruins are not just in Italy. They are in our politics, our media, our morality. Because every civilization that learns to enjoy cruelty will rebuild the Colosseum in its own way. Rome's final empire was not land or law, it was psychology, a machine that taught humanity to feel virtuous while being complicit. And until we learn to break that rhythm, the games will never end. The Colosseum stands today, stripped of its marble, silent but unrepentant. Tourists circle its bones, taking pictures where others once took lives. Guides call it an architectural wonder, but the air still hums with ghosts. For this was not a monument to beauty, it was an accounting system for pain. And when you walk through its arches, you are walking through the balance sheet of human cruelty. Every stone is a number, every arch an entry in the ledger. Somewhere between the lions and the laws, Rome proved a devastating truth, that civilization does not erase brutality, it perfects it. It gives it purpose, order, and applause. The games were never chaos, They were control. They converted murder into ceremony, obedience into virtue. The empire didn't just command armies, it commanded emotion. The people believed they were witnessing justice, but in truth, they were being trained to mistake domination for duty and horror for harmony. That is how Rome lasted so long, not through fear alone, but through participation. In the end, the empire fell not because of barbarians, but because it forgot the difference between law and theatre. It believed it could govern forever by spectacle, until the cost became unbearable. It exhausted its gold, its animals, its enemies, and finally, its people's capacity to believe. When the applause died, the empire's heart stopped with it. The bones that lie beneath Rome's ruins are not just remains, they are data. Each fracture tells of a system that recorded pain like profit. They remind us that cruelty, once rationalized, always becomes policy, and that the real danger of power is not the tyrant's whip, it's the citizen's cheer. The Colosseum's design became humanity's template, tiered seats for hierarchy, central stage for sacrifice, applause for absolution. We rebuild it again and again, in every age, every ideology. Its shape hides in the geometry of our politics, our media, even our morality. Every time we justify violence as necessary, every time we call spectacle unity, we reopen those gates. Rome never ended. It simply learned to wear better clothes. The historian Tacitus once wrote, "They create desolation and call it peace." But the truth was darker. They created entertainment and called it civilization. They turned pain into pedagogy, grief into governance. And we, centuries later, still inherit that grammar. The final irony is that Rome's greatest monument is also its confession. The Colosseum was not built to last as ruin. It was meant to last as memory. A perfect circle of stone where the state could teach the people the cost of disobedience. But time reversed the lesson. Now, the ruins teach us something Rome never intended, that cruelty cannot sustain power, and applause cannot sanctify evil. When you stand inside that arena and look up at the sunlight, you see what Rome refused to see. That civilization is not measured by its architecture, but by what it refuses to celebrate. The Colosseum's arches are empty because the gods it worshipped, conquest, obedience, and spectacle, are dead. And yet, their echoes linger wherever we watch suffering and call it necessary. So when the ledger finally closes, when the last spectator leaves and the dust settles, what remains is not victory, not grandeur, not empire. What remains is a warning that no civilization can survive once it learns to find pleasure in cruelty. Because the moment pain becomes policy, decline is already written. Rome's bones still speak, not to glorify, but to testify. They whisper what every empire forgets, that the true cost of glory is not measured in gold or land, but in silence. The silence of those who watched, the silence of those who obeyed, the silence that built an empire and then buried it. If you listen closely beneath the tourist chatter and camera clicks, you can still hear it, a faint rhythm underfoot. Not the echo of war drums, but the pulse of a truth Rome tried to erase, that the sand remembers, and the bones, even after 2 millennia, still speak. Completed.